Hello and welcome to an A-level Russia in Revolution revision session. We're going to consider today why was there no revolution before 1905. And if you're wondering and feeling that you're the only one doing revision today, then you're not alone. There are approximately 657,999 students. That's slightly made up figure, but based on the number of people taking exams this year, also revising tonight. Okay, so then let's consider this. Why was there no revolution before 1905? There are 4 or 5 main reasons: repressive policies, Orthodox Church, reforms, lack of industrial development, Okhrana, Cossacks and the army. What we're going to do is have a look at each one of these. We're also then going to consider which is the most important reason that there was no revolution before 1905 to maybe the least important, and then you need to start testing yourself. So just thinking about those key policy or kind of factor names, what can you recall, what would you be able to do without looking at this information? By doing some more active revision, you're much more likely to get a better result in the exam than just listening or watching this video. Okay, so let's start with repressive policies then. Repressive policies is definitely one reason why there was no revolution before 1905. It doesn't mean to say that there was no reaction against the Tsar or that there were no uprisings, but a revolution is an attempt at a total change rather than just at kind of asking for change that they're trying to completely overthrow. So repressive policies. Alexander III, obviously the oppressive Tsar, after his father Alexander II was assassinated by the people's will. Alexander III practiced censorship as one of his repressive policies. So, for example, 14 major newspapers were banned between 1982 and 1989. So that would stop people from being able to spread any anti-Tsarist propaganda. So they're banning any newspapers that went against the Tsar. It was effectively treason if you were to oppose the Tsar in any way. They also introduced laws under Alexander III's oppressive policies, such as the university state-controlled. So universities were state-controlled from around 1884, progressively more so onwards. So they could control what was being taught and also who was attending. So that they restricted access by increasing university fees, so that the lower ranks and the peasants and things like that, they would never be able to access that level of education. The more educated someone was, the more likely it would be that they would be able to spread propaganda against the Tsar or kind of come across ideas where they might question what was going on in their society. And in fact, they closed the universities in 1889 during protests in order to try and stop those protests from happening. The Tsar Alexander III and actually also Nicholas II, they were both tutored by Pobedonostsev, and he was a minister. He believed autocracy was the best form of government, and in actual fact he called democracy as sort of like a lie of our time. He didn't believe in it at all. So he encouraged them to really reinforce autocracy, the complete opposite of democracy. So Alexander III released a manifesto declaring the absolute power of the Tsar, and he truly believed that he was chosen by God. And so using these ideas, he was very repressive in his censorship and also use of other repressive methods. So that's the next thing we're going to have a look at, is actually the Okhrana, the Cossacks and the army. So let me just move these ones out of the way. So use of the Okhrana, Cossacks and the army. 45% of annual expenditure was given to the army. So nearly half of the money that Russia spent every year was spent on the army. So this meant that they were a powerful force and they had a lot of training, and they also had a lot of money for all their weaponry and things like that. And this is one reason why there was no revolution before 1905, as it meant that they were a powerful force. And the army wasn't actually involved in foreign wars in this period, because since the Crimean War of 1854 to 56, Russia wasn't actually at war with many other countries. So it meant they could focus on putting down any kind of riots and strikes and things like that. So it meant they were in a much stronger position. So, for example, The Cossacks, which were an elite force, were used to suppress strikes in Odessa in 1903 and also Rostov in 1902. So they're being used in order to prevent there being any form of uprising, or when there was an uprising, to quickly put it down. Because they're totally focused on that and not on other countries and things like that, like they are later on a little bit more. If you think of 1905, obviously you've got things like the Russo-Japanese War, then 1914, you've got World War One. Because the army are more involved in other wars, they're in a weaker position slightly. So before 1905, in this period that we're looking at anyway, between 1881 and 1905, because they're not involved in foreign wars, they're in a much stronger position to put down any protests and riots. There's also the use of the Okhrana, the secret police, who could arrest people and send them off to camps. They worked undercover, infiltrating organisations and groups which might present a danger to the Tsar. So they were quite useful as well for arresting anyone who maybe might be an enemy of the Tsar. So again, another way that there was no revolution before 1905. A slightly more unusual reason, I suppose, could be the Orthodox Church. This was another reason why there was no revolution before 1905. Partly because the Orthodox Church was very conservative in its beliefs, which means that they opposed change. They wanted to preserve the Tsarist system. They liked the way that things ran in their country and they didn't want change. Unlike the Catholic Church in Europe, the Russian Orthodox Church was completely separate. So they didn't have a papacy, they didn't have a pope. So they kind of looked to the Tsar as the head of their church. In fact, in their catechism, which is basically a list of the essential points of their faith, it included an instruction that God commands that we obey and love the Tsar. So the Orthodox Church taught people to be loyal to the Tsar. That was part of their faith. And it was something that people took incredibly seriously. We'll look at the reforms in a minute that were made by Alexander III, but as part of Russification, the Orthodox Church the Russian Orthodox faith was considered the essential faith of Russia. So the faith of the country is reinforcing as well that people should obey the Tsar and follow the Tsar. So it helped to prevent there being a revolution before 1905 as well. Okay, so let's have a look at reforms then. Another key reason that there was no revolution before 1905, I suppose you could consider some of the repressive policies were reforms as well, but let's look at some further reforms. So we've mentioned briefly already Russification. They made the Russian language the official language of the country. They made Russian Orthodox Church the official religion. And all these sorts of things, and it was making people feel more united, so less likely to kind of rebel, I guess. But they also, I'm going to skip over the next one for a second and look at this bit here. The government encouraged Russian nationalists. This links to the pogroms I'm about to talk about. So the government encouraged people to kind of react against anyone that they saw as being non-Russian, so minority groups in particular. Unfortunately, people ended up targeting in pogroms, violent attacks, the Jewish population of Russia. There were around 5 million of them at the time. And the government encouraged it as a form of what Michael Lynch has called bloodletting, effectively almost kind of someone to pour their anger out at. It's not based on the government. They're not looking to the government. So, for example, groups like the Black Hundreds were encouraged to attack non-Russian groups such as the Jewish population. Another reason there was no revolution before 1905. Again, another reform, the Statute of State Security was created by Alexander III as one of his reforms, which meant the government controlled courts and they could implement trial without jury. So anyone who was seen to be a threat to the Tsar could be put on trial without a jury, and given that also later on they basically controlled the courts as well, that meant that they could arrest whoever they wanted, really. Again, another reform we could look at, which gave the government more power, so it made it less likely that there would be a revolution, was that the local organisations, if you like, almost like a local council, the Zemstva, originally were run by local justices of the peace, so people who were locally elected, councillors almost, if you like. But in the 1890s, they were replaced by land captains instead. So rather than being locally elected people in charge of their local zemstva, you'd have an aristocrat, a really rich person, who is therefore automatically more likely to support the Tsar and not want change, is replacing that justice of the peace. So you've got rich land captains instead of locally elected people in charge of the zemstva. And also, there was the Zemstva Act of 1890, which meant the government could intervene with local decisions. So that meant they could control what was and wasn't happening, and they could tell people that they were doing the wrong thing or change the policies. So this meant that there was much less likely to be a revolution before 1905, because the government could control what people were doing, and if they felt that anyone was questioning the Tsar's authority in any way, then they could just stop them from being involved in local politics. Additionally, another reform, perhaps a more positive one than the other ones we've discussed, Nikolai Bunge, who was at one point the finance minister, he reduced tax burdens on peasants, and he created a peasant land bank as well, so they could get loans, which meant that the peasants were able to farm a larger area of land. And although he couldn't prevent famines, such as the one that happened in 1891, this did help mean that there was less likely to be a revolution, because the peasants felt that the Tsar, although in this case it's actually Nikolai Bunge, was looking out for their interests in some way. Okay, and finally, let's have a look at the other reason why there was a lack of revolution or revolutionary feeling before 1905, lack of industrial development. So this might seem like an obvious one in many ways, but I feel that people forget to mention it. There was a lack of transportation. Obviously, the Trans-Siberian Railway wasn't built until 1891 to 1902 by Witte, and there was an underdeveloped system of roads as well. So if it's hard for people to travel around the country, then that makes it harder for ideas to spread, and if they do spread, they spread more slowly. So that meant that revolutionary ideas were less likely to spread quickly before 1905. If people aren't united with this idea, then it means that any protests would be more sporadic and therefore easier to put down. You've also got the fact that 80% of the population are peasants. They're illiterate, roughly anyway, 82% in I think 1881, but because they're illiterate, that makes it harder for them to access any ideas and sort of propaganda against the government, and it's largely a cottage industry that you've got going on in Russia at the time, so people producing wood and woolen goods to supplement farming in rural areas. They're spread out across Russia, which is a huge area of land. So this helps the Tsar to maintain his authority, because most of the population are illiterate. They can't access any books or pamphlets against the Tsar. They're remote. They're widely dispersed in their villages. It's difficult for them to unite and to challenge the Tsar, because of the size of Russia and because of the lack of transportation and goods. And because they're living and working in cottage industries, that meant that they're not in the large numbers that they are when they move into factories and become industrial workers in around the time of 1905 after the Great Spurt. So it was less likely that they were going to rise up and revolt, because they're more spread out and less likely to be able to unite against the Tsar. Okay, and now for a sixth reason that hopefully you've noticed is deliberately missed out previously. Another reason why there was no revolution before 1905 is, of course, that there was a disunited opposition against the Tsar. So, how did a disunited opposition to the Tsar mean that there was no revolution before 1905? Well, largely, basically, the different groups who did oppose the Tsar or the policies of the Tsar didn't agree on what they disagreed about or how things should be fought against the Tsar, and therefore they're not united, and it's not easy for them to oppose the Tsar. So, for example, that you've got the populists, from which the People's Will terrorist group originated. They were the ones who assassinated the Tsar liberator Alexander II, and as such, they actually discredited themselves in 1891, and they became much less popular because of the assassination of Alexander II, because the idea of the populists originally had been that they wanted reform, and Alexander II had introduced many reforms, like, for example, the 1861 reform where he freed all the peasants. So they lost numbers because of their methods. People didn't believe that they really meant what they said. And the split away group, so Viktor Chernov later on in 1901 decided to form the Social Revolutionaries, they wanted revolutionary change as well. But the Social Revolutionaries were also not united in what they wanted. So there were two kind of sides to it. There were those who wanted to continue with the populist original ideas of using terrorism and very extreme methods to get what they wanted. And there were also a large number of moderates who were prepared to cooperate with others to try and improve the lives of the peasants, and that was what they wanted most, as opposed to those wanting more terror in the Social Revolutionaries who wanted to just get rid of the Tsar. Additionally, another group formed in 1898, so before the Social Revolutionaries, in fact, and they were the Social Democrats. They had ideas of Marxism, the idea that society evolved in a particular way and it was following a particular pathway, and eventually you'd end up with everyone being sort of equal in some ways. They were more popular after the Great Spurt because there was an industrial working class, and that's who they targeted. They were basically aimed for a society in which one of the stages is that the industrial working class would rule the country, But even within this Social Democrat Party with Marxist ideas, there were splits in what the methods should be that they should oppose the Tsar. So Plekhanov was the original leader of the Social Democrats, and he wanted reform, whereas Lenin was more interested in revolution as being the main aim of the party. So by 1903, the party, 5 years after it had been formed, split into two other groups as well. So you've got the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. Mensheviks being Plekhanov's group, they believed that everyone could be involved in the revolution, and the Bolsheviks, who believed it needed to be a sort of professional revolution led by professional revolutionaries. So they're busy bickering amongst themselves, so they're not able to focus on opposing the Tsar. And additionally, you've got the liberal group. So liberals were people who wanted reform, but they didn't want to destroy the Tsar. So again, they weren't really interested in revolution. They were more interested in pressuring for reform. So all of these groups show that there was no revolution before 1905 because people just weren't united in their opposition against the Tsar, and also they weren't united in their aims either. So it meant that their voices weren't as strong when they were opposing the Tsar or pressuring for reform. Okay, so having heard all of the different reasons why the Tsar didn't face revolution before 1905, so now consider, of all these reasons that we have looked at in this video, which one of these reasons do you think is the most important reason that the Tsar didn't face revolution until 1905? And which one of these reasons do you think maybe is the least important reason? Remember, you're most likely to be asked the sort of question where you have to say, was X the most important reason why there was no revolution before 1905? So, for example, one of the past paper questions was it a disunited opposition that was the main reason why there was no opposition to the Tsar before 1905? So, do you agree that that's the case, or do you think something else is more likely to be the reason for it? Try planning yourself an essay on this topic and having a go at writing an essay on this topic. Remember, you've got 40 minutes to do it. Okay, that's the end of this revision session. Good luck with your revision.